The whisper that shook the courtroom. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 7A creaked under the weight of another contentious morning. The air inside was thick with tension, the kind that only came with high-stakes custody battles. Judge Naomi Miller sat at the bench, her black robe draped over her shoulders like armor. Her sharp dark eyes scanned the room, assessing every detail as attorneys battled in front of her. She had seen thousands of these cases in her 15-year career, but no matter how many she presided over, they always stirred something deep within her. Maybe it was because she had once been a grieving mother herself, 5 years ago, when she lost her baby before he had even taken his first breath. The lawyers' voices clashed like swords, bouncing off the polished wood-paneled walls. "Your Honor," the defense attorney argued passionately, "my clients have provided a loving foster home for this child for 6 months now. Stability is key at his age." And yet, the opposing counsel interrupted. "There have been concerning reports about." Judge Miller sighed and raised her hand for silence. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe I have heard enough for today." She picked up her gavel, prepared to adjourn the session, when a tiny voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Judge." It was barely a whisper, but somehow it carried across the courtroom, stopping everyone in their tracks. Naomi's fingers froze over her gavel. "On your son." Silence fell. The kind of silence that sucked all the air out of the room. The kind that made time itself pause. Naomi felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs. "What?" She blinked, sure she had misheard. Slowly, her eyes found the source of the voice. A little boy, no older than 5, sitting beside his court-appointed social worker. His small, delicate hands clutched the arms of his chair. His dark curls framed wide, serious eyes. Eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. Naomi swallowed hard. "What did you say?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. The boy stood up. His social worker, Miss Jenkins, instinctively reached for his shoulder, but he stepped away. His tiny frame straightened as he repeated, louder this time, "I'm your son. I've been looking for you." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Naomi's world tilted, her head swimming. Her vision blurred as she stared at the boy, her mind desperately trying to process what she was hearing. "This isn't possible. It can't be." Her hands, which had held the gavel steady for over a decade, trembled. The whispers in the room grew louder, filled with confusion and disbelief. She caught a glimpse of the locket in the boy's hand. Naomi's breath hitched. A silver locket, the exact match to the one that had hung around her neck for the past 5 years. The same scratch on the back, the very one she had left when she dropped it in the hospital parking lot. The same locket she had buried with her stillborn baby. Her knees nearly gave out. The attorneys were speaking. Miss Jenkins was flipping through paperwork in a panic, but Naomi couldn't process any of it. Her entire world had just shattered. "Bailiff." Her voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "Lock the doors. Now." The security guard moved quickly, the locks clicking into place like a gunshot. No one was leaving this courtroom. Naomi turned to Miss Jenkins, who looked as pale as a ghost. "Explain this. Now." The social worker was visibly shaking. I don't understand, Your Honor." She shuffled through her files with frantic fingers. "Elijah has been in the foster system since he was found abandoned at 18 months old. There's no record of his biological parents. His birth certificate was missing." Naomi's breath was coming in ragged gasps. 18 months. That would have been just after the time her son was supposed to have died. No, it couldn't be. But the locket. The locket was real. Her mind reeled, flashing back to that horrible night 5 years ago. The emergency C-section, the doctor's gray face, the devastating words. "Your baby didn't make it." She had never even gotten to hold him. Naomi felt lightheaded, her hands gripping the desk to keep herself from collapsing. "But they told me," her voice cracked. "They told me he was gone." Had they lied? Her hand shook as she reached for the locket around her neck. With trembling fingers, she unfastened it and opened it. Inside was the only image she had ever had of her baby, a tiny sonogram picture. She looked at the locket in Elijah's hand. It was the same. Identical. How was this possible? Her vision blurred as she looked at the little boy before her, his deep brown eyes staring into hers with a quiet certainty. They were her eyes. The room spun, faces blurred together. Attorneys, confused foster parents, bailiffs, all frozen in disbelief. Elijah took a step closer. "I remember your voice." Naomi's pulse hammered in her ears. "You remember?" Elijah nodded. "You used to sing to me." Something inside Naomi snapped. A distant memory rushed forward. The night she had spent singing lullabies to her swollen belly, her voice the only thing soothing her unborn child. No one else knew about that. No one. The courtroom seemed to close in around her. Could it be true? Could this little boy really be hers? Or was this some kind of cruel mistake? She forced herself to take a breath. She needed to think. She needed answers. Her hands clenched into fists. "Court is dismissed." The words came out with barely contained urgency. The attorneys protested, but Naomi didn't care. Everyone out. Now. As the crowd filtered out, stunned into silence, Naomi stumbled to her feet. The weight of her robe felt suffocating. The air was too thick, the room too small. She turned and ran through her chamber doors, barely making it to her private office before the sobs overtook her. She slid down the cold tile wall, her whole body shaking. The locket burned against her chest. 5 years. 5 years of grieving. 5 years of trying to move on. 5 years of believing her baby was gone. But now, there was a chance. And with that chance came a chilling realization. If Elijah was her son, who took him? And if she uncovered the truth, would she survive it? The truth begins to unravel. Naomi sat hunched over her desk, the weight of reality pressing down on her like a collapsing building. The polished mahogany surface of her desk was now covered with documents she had pulled from her personal files, hospital records, and old medical documents that she had stored away in a futile attempt to find closure. Her hands trembled as she spread them out, eyes frantically scanning the words that had haunted her for the last 5 years. Stillborn. Time of death. 3:15 a.m. She had read those words 100 times before, each time solidifying the grief that had wrapped around her like chains. But now, after today, those words felt like a lie. The room around her was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passing seconds as her mind reeled. The locket in her palm felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of her entire past and the unanswered questions that were clawing at her insides. She looked at the identical locket Elijah had clutched in his tiny hands, and her heart clenched so tightly she thought she might not be able to breathe. How had he gotten this? There was no way, that this was a coincidence. A gentle knock at the door made her jump. She took a deep breath, quickly wiping the dampness from her cheeks before straightening her posture. "Enter," she called, her voice only slightly betraying the chaos inside her. Miss Jenkins stepped inside hesitantly, still holding Elijah's case file in her hands. Her usual professional demeanor had been replaced by clear discomfort, as though she was stepping into something far bigger than she had ever intended to be involved in. Behind her, Mr. Davidson, the court clerk, hovered uncertainly, his face set in an expression of deep concern. "Your Honor," Miss Jenkins began, carefully choosing her words as she stepped forward. "There's something you should know about Elijah." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Miss Jenkins exhaled slowly and took the seat across from Naomi, placing the case file between them. "This isn't the first time Elijah has done this, not just with you." Naomi stilled, her fingers tightening around the edges of the papers before her. "What do you mean?" Miss Jenkins hesitated, glancing down at the file. Over the past 3 years, Elijah has been placed in multiple foster homes, more than most children his age. but not because of behavioral issues or anything like that. Every time he gets comfortable in a home, he starts insisting that one of the adults is his biological parent. Naomi's brows furrowed. He's done this before. Miss Jenkins nodded, her expression grave. 7 times. 7 different judges, lawyers, or foster parents, people in authoritative positions. Each time, he told them that they were his parent, but none of them ever had a direct connection to his past. A strange, cold feeling crept up Naomi's spine. But this time is different, isn't it? She murmured, glancing at the locket in her palm. Miss Jenkins swallowed hard. Yes, this time, there's proof. Naomi's chest tightened, her eyes flickering between the file, the locket, and Miss Jenkins. There was something more here, something that went beyond a lost boy looking for a family. Has he ever mentioned anything specific? Naomi asked. Miss Jenkins glanced back at Mr. Davidson before replying. Not usually. Just vague things. A feeling, a memory, a name sometimes. But never anything that lined up with his actual past records. That's why the agency assumed it was a trauma response. But this time, she gestured toward the locket. He had something physical to back up his claim. Naomi's fingers tightened around the cool metal of the pendant. Where did he get this? Miss Jenkins frowned. He wouldn't say. He just had it when they found him. Silence stretched between them. Naomi felt the weight of the revelation settle into her bones. If Elijah was her son, if the hospital had lied to her, if someone had stolen her baby and erased his past, then someone had also made sure to cover their tracks. And that meant that someone out there knew the truth. Her mind raced. She needed to get to the bottom of this. May I speak with him? Naomi asked suddenly, surprising even herself. Miss Jenkins hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Of course, he's waiting outside. A minute later, the door opened again, and Elijah stepped inside. He was so small, Naomi realized. So small. His dark curls were slightly messy, his brown eyes wide but cautious, filled with a knowledge that went far beyond his 5 years of life. He approached the chair across from Naomi, but didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he just studied her. The intensity of his gaze made Naomi's breath catch. Elijah, she said softly, can you tell me how you knew about me? Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question carefully. Then, slowly, he spoke. I remember your voice, he said simply. Naomi's fingers trembled. My voice. Elijah nodded, his fingers absent-mindedly playing with the locket around his neck. And I remember someone taking me away. His voice grew softer, more uncertain. I have bad dreams about it sometimes. Naomi leaned forward, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Do you remember who took you? Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. It was dark, he murmured. But I remember the stars. Naomi's lips parted slightly. The stars. Elijah nodded, his little fingers tracing a pattern in the air. Like the one on the car. A silver star. The room felt like it had tilted. A silver star. The symbol of the Hawthorne Foundation, one of the wealthiest families in the city. Naomi felt something cold and sharp pierce her gut. For years, the Hawthornes had been untouchable, wrapped in layers of political power and generational wealth. But why would their symbol be connected to Elijah's disappearance? Miss Jenkins, Naomi said suddenly, her voice tight. I need every record on Elijah. Every placement, every foster home, every hospital log. And I need access to my own medical records. Miss Jenkins swallowed. That might be difficult. Why? Naomi pressed. Because your records. Miss Jenkins hesitated. They're sealed. Naomi froze. Sealed. By who? And why? The hospital's automated system clicked on as Naomi dialed the number she had called countless times before, back when she was drowning in grief, looking for answers. Records department, please, she requested, forcing her voice into a neutral tone. After several transfers and long holds, a clerk finally answered. I need access to all records related to a birth on April 15th, 5 years ago, Naomi stated, her judicial authority creeping into her voice. Patient name, Naomi Miller. A pause. Then the sound of typing. I'm sorry, the clerk finally said, her voice distant. But those records are restricted. Naomi sat up straighter. Restricted. I'm the patient. I should have full access to my own medical records. The files have been sealed by court order, the clerk explained. I can't access them without proper authorization. Naomi's blood ran cold. Who sealed them? She asked sharply. I'm sorry, Your Honor, the clerk said quietly. That information is also restricted. Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone. Something was very, very wrong. And she was going to find out what. A trail of secrets. The drive to County General Hospital was a blur. Naomi's mind raced, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that had remained hidden for 5 years. The sealed records, Elijah's unexplained presence in the foster system, the locket, a perfect match to the one she had buried with her son. And now, the most chilling clue yet, a silver star. Her knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as she turned onto the hospital's main drive, her heart hammering. It was past visiting hours, but that wouldn't stop her. She was a judge, a woman of authority, and she wasn't leaving until she got answers. She parked hastily and strode through the automatic glass doors, her heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale air, a place filled with too many painful memories. The reception desk was manned by a tired-looking nurse who barely looked up as Naomi approached. I need to speak with the hospital administrator, Naomi stated, keeping her voice firm but not aggressive. The nurse sighed, her fingers still poised over the keyboard. Visiting hours are over, ma'am. You'll have to return. I need to speak with the hospital administrator, Naomi repeated, her tone sharper now. She reached into her bag, pulling out her judicial identification and placing it on the counter. This is an urgent legal matter. I need access to sealed medical records from 5 years ago. If you can't help me, then get someone who can. That got the nurse's attention. She blinked, hesitated for only a second, then picked up the phone. A few murmured words later, she gestured toward the elevator. 3rd floor, Dr. Patel's office. But he's a busy man, she warned, already turning back to her computer. Don't expect him to drop everything for you. Naomi didn't respond. She was already heading for the elevator. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, she stepped out into the administrative wing. It was quieter up here, the air conditioned, and sterile. The door to Dr. Patel's office was slightly ajar, and she could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. She knocked once and then pushed the door open. Dr. Rahul Patel sat behind his massive oak desk, his graying hair neatly combed, his face set in a careful expression of neutrality. Across from him sat Detective Sarah Reynolds, an old law school friend of Naomi's who had become one of the city's top detectives. The two of them looked up at Naomi's entrance, their conversation cut short. Judge Miller, Dr. Patel greeted her smoothly, though she noted the flicker of something in his eyes. Apprehension. What can I do for you? Naomi closed the door behind her, her pulse pounding. I want my medical records, she said without preamble. From 5 years ago, the birth of my son. Dr. Patel exhaled through his nose, as if he had been expecting this. I see. He folded his hands on the desk. I assume you've already been told they are sealed. Yes, Naomi said, crossing her arms. And I want to know why. Dr. Patel hesitated, then turned to Detective Reynolds, who had remained silent until now. You didn't tell her, he asked. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temple. I only found out this morning, she admitted, looking at Naomi. Your files weren't just sealed, Naomi. They were classified under a court order signed by an unknown authority. Naomi frowned. Unknown. How is that possible? Sarah shook her head. The digital trail has been scrubbed clean. No judge's name, no paper trail, nothing. Just a court order that has no legal explanation. Naomi's stomach churned. Someone had gone through great lengths to bury the truth. Dr. Patil cleared his throat. Look, Judge Miller, I don't know who sealed those records, but I can tell you this. There were irregularities surrounding your case that night. Things that didn't add up. And I wasn't the administrator at the time, so I had no control over what happened. But when I took over this hospital last year, I noticed discrepancies. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. What kind of discrepancies? Dr. Patil glanced toward his computer and then back at her, his face unreadable. The delivery notes on your file were edited after your C-section. The attending physician listed, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, was recorded as signing off on your child's death certificate before your procedure even began. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. That's impossible. Dr. Patel nodded grimly. Exactly. And that's not all. Security footage from that night. Gone. Digital logs. Corrupted. It's as if someone erased every trace of what happened. Sarah interjected, which means someone wanted to cover it up. Naomi's nails dug into her palms. Dr. Richard Hawthorne. She had heard that name before. He was head of obstetrics back then, Dr. Patil explained, as if reading her thoughts. But he disappeared 3 years ago. No forwarding address. No records. It's like he never existed. Naomi sat down heavily in the chair across from Dr. Patel, her head spinning. So you're telling me that the doctor who signed my son's death certificate, before he was even delivered, has vanished, and my records have been erased. Dr. Patel nodded solemnly. I don't know what happened that night, Judge Miller, but I can tell you this. Someone stole your baby. The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Her baby, the child she had grieved for years, the one she had believed was lost forever. Stolen. A part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear apart the hospital looking for the truth. But she forced herself to remain calm. Anger wouldn't help Elijah. She took a steadying breath. Dr. Patel, do you still have access to the old files, even if they're corrupted? He hesitated before nodding. There might be a way. But if I start digging, whoever is behind this will know. I don't care, Naomi said. Do it. Sarah leaned forward. We need to move carefully, Naomi. Whoever did this had power. Connections. If you start making noise, they might come after you. Naomi met her gaze, her expression unyielding. Let them come. I lost my son once. I'm not losing him again. Sarah exhaled, then nodded. All right. Then we do this the right way. We build a case. We find proof. And when we have enough, we take them down. Naomi's pulse thundered in her ears, but her resolve was solid. For 5 years, she had lived in pain, grief, and unanswered questions. That ended today. Because she was going to bring the truth to light. And no one was going to stop her. Unraveling the lies. Naomi sat in the dim glow of her home office, her desk cluttered with hospital records, legal documents, and the scribbled notes she had gathered over the last 24 hours. Her mind raced as she reviewed each piece of evidence, every inconsistency, every red flag. The truth was starting to take shape, but it was still fragmented, elusive, like a puzzle missing its most crucial pieces. Dr. Richard Hawthorne. The name loomed in her thoughts like a shadow. The man who had signed her son's death certificate before her delivery even began. A doctor who had mysteriously vanished 3 years ago, leaving behind no trace. His name had never been suspicious to her before. Why would it be? She had been too devastated by grief to question anything. But now, looking back, nothing about that night made sense. She picked up her phone and dialed Detective Sarah Reynolds, who had spent the last few hours digging into Dr. Hawthorne's records. Naomi tapped her fingers anxiously against the wooden desk as the line rang. Finally, Sarah answered, her voice tense. Naomi, I think I found something. Naomi straightened in her chair. Tell me. Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking, as if she was still trying to believe what she had uncovered. Dr. Hawthorne wasn't just any doctor. He was one of the top obstetricians in the state, specializing in high-risk pregnancies. But get this, over a span of 8 years, more than a dozen newborns were declared stillborn under his care. Naomi's blood ran cold. Stillborn? Sarah sighed. Yes, but the strange part, none of the mothers ever got to see their babies, just like you. The infants were taken immediately, and the families were given generic hospital-issued death certificates. No further investigations. No autopsies. A sick feeling settled in Naomi's stomach. How many mothers had suffered the same fate as she had? How many of them had buried their grief, never questioning the truth? She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. What else did you find? Sarah's voice grew quieter, more cautious. Naomi, Dr. Hawthorne's son, Nathaniel Hawthorne, is a major shareholder in multiple private adoption agencies across the country. Agencies that specialize in high-profile adoptions for the ultra-wealthy. Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. You're telling me that these stolen babies were being sold? I think so. Sarah's voice was grim. And I think Elijah was one of them. Naomi's stomach turned. It was one thing to suspect it, another thing to hear it confirmed. She looked over at Elijah, who was asleep on the couch, curled up with his stuffed animal. His tiny chest rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, completely unaware of the dark secrets that surrounded his past. Her baby had been stolen. Her son was meant to be sold. Naomi pressed her fingers against her temples, rage simmering beneath her skin. Someone had taken him from her, erased his identity, and left him to vanish into the system. But something had gone wrong. He had ended up in foster care instead of an elite adoption agency. Had he been abandoned? Had the transaction fallen through? And more importantly, if someone had wanted him gone, would they come back to finish what they started? She turned back to the phone. Sarah, we need to move fast. If Nathaniel Hawthorne is involved, then we need concrete proof. He has resources. If he realizes we're onto him, he'll destroy any remaining evidence before we can use it. Sarah exhaled. I know. I already pulled his financial records. There's one transaction that stands out. A large payment made 5 years ago to a now-defunct medical research facility. The recipient, a shell company tied to a private adoption agency that was quietly shut down after multiple accusations of illegal trafficking. Naomi's heart pounded. A direct link. She swallowed hard, gripping the armrest of her chair. And what about Dr. Hawthorne? Where did he go? Sarah hesitated. I might have found something on that too. An old property listed under his wife's maiden name. A cabin. About an hour outside the city. Naomi's pulse quickened. You think he's hiding there? I think it's worth checking out. Naomi stood, her decision made. Let's go. Tonight. Sarah was silent for a moment. Naomi, are you sure? If Nathaniel or anyone else is involved in this, they won't just let you expose them. These people, they're dangerous. Naomi glanced at Elijah, her resolve hardening. They already took 5 years of my son's life from me. I won't let them take another second. The cabin in the woods. The night was thick with fog as Naomi and Sarah drove along the winding mountain road. The headlights of their car cut through the dense trees, illuminating the dirt path ahead. The forest seemed eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Sarah checked the GPS. We're close. The property is just up ahead. Naomi kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the wheel. She had spent years searching for answers, and now she was closer than ever. As they approached the small, isolated cabin, Sarah gestured for Naomi to kill the headlights. We don't want to announce ourselves. Naomi complied, pulling the car to a slow stop about 50 feet from the structure. The cabin itself was modest, worn down, the paint peeling from the wooden siding, But despite its abandoned appearance, there was a faint light glowing from inside. Someone was here. Sarah unholstered her gun. "Stay behind me." They approached cautiously, keeping close to the shadows. Naomi's breath came in slow, controlled inhales, her entire body wired with tension. Sarah reached the porch first and tried the door. Locked. She knocked. No response. After a few seconds, she knocked again, louder this time. "Dr. Hawthorne," she called. "We just want to talk." Silence. Naomi felt a shiver crawl down her spine. Something wasn't right. Sarah exchanged a glance with Naomi before trying the doorknob again, this time applying more force. With a quick movement, she braced her shoulder against the door, and it burst open. Inside, the cabin was small, the air thick with the smell of mothballs and stale wood. The furniture was old, covered in dust. A few books were scattered on a wooden table, along with stacks of papers and folders. And in the corner, a man. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, or at least, what was left of him. The frail, ghostly figure was hunched over, his face hollow, his skin sickly and pale. He sat in an old chair, his eyes sunken, the weight of his past eating away at him. He lifted his gaze, and for a moment, he just stared. Naomi froze, a mix of fury and anticipation swelling in her chest. Sarah took a step forward. "Dr. Hawthorne, we need answers." The man let out a slow, rattling breath. "You already know, don't you?" His voice was thin, brittle, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Naomi clenched her fists. "I want to hear you say it." Dr. Hawthorne's lips trembled, but he didn't look away. Then, finally, "Your son was never dead." The words echoed through the small cabin, settling over them like a crushing weight. Naomi's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Dr. Hawthorne's hands shook as he exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "They took him. They took so many." Naomi's breath caught. And in that moment, she knew this was only the beginning. The doctor's confession. The dim light from a single hanging bulb flickered above, casting eerie shadows across the dusty walls of the cabin. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, mildew, and something darker, the stench of secrets buried for far too long. Naomi stood frozen, her fingers clenched into fists as she stared at the man who had held the truth she had been seeking for 5 years. Dr. Richard Hawthorne. The name had haunted her since she learned it. The doctor who had signed her stillbirth certificate before her son was even born. The man who had disappeared, slipping away into obscurity. Now, here he was, a ghost of himself, frail and hollow-eyed, haunted by whatever sins he had committed. Naomi's voice was sharp, cutting through the stagnant air. "Tell me everything." Dr. Hawthorne exhaled shakily, his bony fingers twitching as they rested against the arms of his chair. "They never intended for you to know," he murmured, his voice weak but steady. "You were never supposed to find out." Naomi stepped closer, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who are they?" The old doctor's eyes flickered toward Detective Reynolds, then back to Naomi. "The men who funded it. The ones who wanted newborns with no legal ties to their pasts. The ones who paid for babies that would never be traced back to their real parents." Naomi's stomach twisted, nausea creeping up her throat. She already knew what he was going to say, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that shattered every remaining piece of her world. "You stole my son," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling. "Didn't you?" Dr. Hawthorne flinched as though the words had struck him physically. His breathing grew heavier, ragged. "Yes," he admitted, the word barely more than a breath. "Not just yours. So many others." The confession hit Naomi like a freight train. She had spent 5 years grieving, believing her son was dead, while all this time he had been alive. Stolen. Sold. The room spun around her, but she forced herself to stay steady. She couldn't afford to break down now. Not when she was this close. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would you do something like this?" Dr. Hawthorne let out a bitter, broken laugh. Money, power, control, and fear. Always fear. Sarah Reynolds crossed her arms, her detective instincts kicking in. "Start from the beginning," she ordered. "We want names, dates, everything." Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaunt face shadowed. He hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. "It started over 15 years ago." His voice was hoarse. A group of influential men, businessmen, politicians, even some in law enforcement, wanted a way to obtain clean children. No legal ties, no complications. These men were powerful. They had money, influence. But adoption was messy, complicated. They wanted a better way. Naomi gritted her teeth. "And you gave it to them." Dr. Hawthorne's eyes darkened. "I didn't create the system. I was just a pawn in it, a well-paid pawn, but a pawn nonetheless." He rubbed his temples as if trying to soothe the ghosts clawing at his mind. The plan was simple. Take newborns from vulnerable mothers, women who wouldn't question things. Falsify stillbirth records. Then, with no legal ties, the infants could be placed into private adoption for a price. Naomi's entire body shook with rage. "You made me believe my son was dead." Dr. Hawthorne flinched. "I didn't handle your case personally." He looked up, his eyes filled with a strange kind of regret. "But I was in the room. I saw them take him." Naomi felt like the walls were closing in. "Who took him?" The doctor hesitated. Then, after a long silence, he whispered the name. "Nathaniel Hawthorne." Naomi felt her breath leave her body in a rush. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the wealthy businessman who had shown up in her courtroom, claiming to be Elijah's biological father. The man whose presence had set off alarms in her mind. The man who had forged every document tying Elijah to him. Nathaniel had taken her son. Sarah Reynolds cursed under her breath. "That son of a..." She stopped herself, taking a deep breath. "We knew he was involved, but to actually take the baby himself." Dr. Hawthorne nodded. "Nathaniel has always been more hands-on than the others." His expression was dark, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like fear. "He doesn't just orchestrate these things, he participates." Naomi's skin went ice cold. She knew Nathaniel Hawthorne was dangerous. She had felt it in every interaction with him. But now, knowing that he had been there, in the delivery room, that he had taken Elijah with his own hands, it made everything worse. She inhaled sharply. Where was Elijah supposed to go? Dr. Hawthorne closed his eyes. "I don't know." Naomi's patience snapped. "Don't lie to me." Dr. Hawthorne's fingers trembled as he looked at her again. "I swear, I don't know. Something went wrong. The original buyer fell through, and Nathaniel must have panicked. He wouldn't have risked keeping the child. That's probably how Elijah ended up in foster care instead of being placed into a high-profile adoption." Naomi swallowed down the bile rising in her throat. Her son had been meant for a black market sale, and only by some twist of fate had he ended up lost in the system instead. "Do you have proof?" Sarah pressed. "Documents, logs, anything." Dr. Hawthorne hesitated. Then his gaze flickered toward a stack of old medical files in the corner of the cabin. Sarah moved first, rifling through them, her breath catching when she found a thin, leather-bound ledger buried beneath the papers. "This is it," she murmured, flipping through pages of handwritten names, transactions, falsified birth records. Naomi's stomach dropped when she saw her own name. Patient: Naomi Miller. Status: stillborn recorded. Infant transferred. Authorized by N. Hawthorne. She gripped the edge of the desk, her vision blurring with rage, grief, and something deeper, determination. They had it now. The proof they needed. Dr. Hawthorne sank back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You can't stop them." Naomi's eyes hardened. "Watch me." The warning. Naomi barely made it through her front door before she heard a familiar buzz. Her phone. A blocked number flashed across the screen. She hesitated only a second before answering. A voice she knew too well came through the line. Nathaniel Hawthorne. You should have walked away, Judge Miller. Her grip tightened on the phone. You're going to prison. Nathaniel chuckled, his voice dark and full of amusement. I don't think so. You see, I have friends in places you can't even imagine. And now, because of your little crusade. A pause. Then, I have your son. Naomi's blood ran cold. A sharp click ended the call. The world around her blurred, her heart hammering in her chest. Nathaniel had Elijah. And now this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was war. A mother's war. Naomi's hands trembled as she gripped her phone, Nathaniel's last words ringing in her ears like a death sentence. I have your son. Her heart pounded violently, her vision blurring as the sheer weight of the moment crashed over her. Elijah was gone. Taken. Stolen from her again. A scream built in her throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to stay calm. No, she wasn't going to break. Not now. Not when her son needed her the most. Her fingers worked quickly as she called Detective Sarah Reynolds, barely giving her a second to answer before she snapped. They took him. Nathaniel took Elijah. There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. What? How? I don't know, Naomi hissed, already moving. She snatched her car keys from the counter, her free hand shaking as she grabbed her gun from her bedside drawer. I came home, and he was just gone. Nathaniel called me. He wanted me to know he has him. Sarah cursed, the sound muffled by the frantic rustling of papers on her end. All right, we'll track his movements. We'll find out where he took Elijah. Naomi's body trembled with fury, with terror, with something darker, pure, burning rage. Nathaniel had stolen her baby once. He had erased Elijah's past, buried him in a system designed to destroy identities and manufacture lies. But by some miracle, Elijah had made his way back to her. And now, Nathaniel was trying to take him away again. No, not this time. Naomi's fingers tightened around her gun. This time, she was coming for him. The hunt begins. By the time Naomi reached Sarah's office, the entire police task force was in chaos. Officers were running in and out, phone calls were being made, and a team was huddled over a map of the city, tracing potential locations where Nathaniel could have taken Elijah. Sarah barely looked up as Naomi stormed in. We've already put out an Amber Alert, she said, flipping through documents. Nathaniel has multiple properties, and we're combing through traffic camera footage to track his last movements. Naomi felt cold, calculating rage settle into her bones. We don't have time to do this the slow way, she said, stepping forward. Nathaniel is powerful. He has people on the inside. He's not going to keep Elijah somewhere we can track. Sarah met her gaze, her expression grim. Then what do you suggest? Naomi slammed a piece of paper down on the desk, a handwritten ledger pulled from Dr. Hawthorne's hidden files. Her fingers tapped a specific entry, one that stood out. A safe house, located on the outskirts of the city. Sarah frowned, scanning the address. This was used for illegal adoptions. Naomi's jaw clenched. More than that. This is where they kept the babies before they were sold. It's off-grid. No records, no surveillance. If Nathaniel wants to keep Elijah hidden, this is where he'll go. Sarah grabbed her gun and nodded. Let's go. The safe house. The drive felt endless. Naomi's heart pounded with every mile, her grip on the steering wheel tight enough to snap bone. Every second that passed was another second that Elijah was in danger. When they finally arrived, the safe house was exactly what Naomi expected. An abandoned estate, large but forgotten, buried deep within a grove of towering oak trees. The air was too quiet, the place too still. Sarah and a team of officers fanned out, moving in silent formation as they approached. Naomi stayed close, her heart hammering, as she held her gun at the ready. Then, a sound. A child's voice. Muffled. Weak. Naomi froze. Elijah. She moved before she could think, her body acting on pure instinct. Kicking down the front door, she ignored Sarah's shouted warnings as she rushed inside. The house was cold, lifeless, but she could hear faint footsteps upstairs, a creaking floorboard. Her pulse roared as she took the steps 2 at a time, her grip tightening on her gun. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. She shoved it open, and there he was, Elijah, small, trembling, eyes wide with fear, bound to a chair, and standing behind him, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He smiled. You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Naomi saw red. Gun raised, she took a step forward, her hand steady despite the rage surging through her. Let him go. Nathaniel chuckled, the sound infuriatingly calm. You really think I'm afraid of you? You think you're going to shoot me, Judge Miller? He tilted his head, watching her carefully. You're a woman of the law, aren't you? You believe in rules. In order. If you kill me, you'll destroy yourself. Naomi's grip tightened on the trigger. You stole my son. Nathaniel shrugged. I made you stronger. That was it. Naomi's finger twitched, but before she could react, Sarah and the officers stormed the room, their weapons raised. Drop it, Hawthorne. Sarah barked. It's over. For the first time, Nathaniel's smirk faltered. He glanced at the window, the hallway, the door, calculating. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he lunged, not at Naomi, not at Sarah, but at Elijah. Naomi didn't hesitate. Her gun fired. Nathaniel staggered, a dark red bloom spreading across his shoulder. He fell back, clutching the wound as officers swarmed him. Elijah let out a sharp cry, his body trembling. Naomi rushed to him, ripping the ropes from his wrists, pulling him into her arms. He sobbed against her, his little hands clutching her shirt like a lifeline. Mommy. Naomi sank to the floor, holding him so tightly, she thought she might never let go. You're safe, she whispered, pressing a shaking kiss to his forehead. You're safe. Nathaniel's hateful glare burned into her from the floor. You think this is the end? He sneered, his voice hoarse with pain. You think you've won? Naomi met his eyes, her expression cold, unshakable. No, she said simply. I know I have. As the officers dragged him away, his threats turned into desperate curses, but Naomi didn't hear them. All she could hear was the sound of Elijah's soft breathing against her shoulder, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt whole again. Home at last. The house felt warmer now, brighter. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, watching Elijah as he ate his favorite macaroni and cheese, his little legs swinging under his chair. Every so often, he would glance up at her, as if making sure she was still there. Every time, she would smile back, because she always would be. The news reports were already circulating. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a key figure in an illegal adoption ring, arrested and charged with multiple counts of trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. The Hawthorne legacy was over. Naomi reached across the table, taking Elijah's small hand in hers. You're home now, sweetheart. Forever. Elijah smiled, a true bright smile. And for the first time, Naomi believed it.